topic we'll be discussing today is jaundice neonatorum, neonatal hyperbilirubinemia. As the name indicates, emia is when you're referring to the plasma, and hyperbilirubin means excessive concentration of bilirubin. So it's basically a condition which is caused by excessive concentration of bilirubin, which can either be unconjugated or a conjugated variety. As we all know, the conjugated is the one that is direct bilirubin, which is water soluble but lipid insoluble, and the unconjugated is the indirect, which is water insoluble but lipid soluble. So we can further classify jaundice into three types, that is prehepatic, in which either there is excessive production of the RBCs or excessive degradation of the RBCs. Hepatic, in which there is an intrinsic liver defect. Posthepatic, when there is an obstruction to biliary flow which leads to the buildup of the bilirubin levels in the blood. At concentrations of about 5 to 7 milligrams per deciliter of serum bilirubin, you start to see the symptoms of jaundice, that is the yellow sclera, the pale skin. Let's discuss the mechanism of bilirubin production and excretion. As we all know, the RBCs normally have lifespan of about 120 days, and after that they are basically excreted. They are basically taken up by the reticuloendothelial cells of the spleen, the liver, and the bone marrow, and then they release the globin chains. The globin chains are further degraded into amino acids, and those amino acids are used to further reconstruct the hemoglobin. They release iron, and the porphyrin ring is basically degraded into biliverdin. The biliverdin is the greenish pigment. The biliverdin, by the enzyme bilirubin reductase, it's converted into bilirubin, which is this yellow pigment. This bilirubin is then released into the plasma, and it's carried by these plasma proteins, that is the albumin. So conditions like the long chain fatty acids and the drugs like sulfonamides will be causing the displacement of the bilirubin from the albumin, and it leads to increased levels of free bilirubin levels in the blood. So the normal process, the bilirubin is basically taken up by the liver cells, and in the liver cells, the hepatocytes, it's glucuronidated by the enzyme UDP glucuronyl transferase, so that it's converted into water soluble form, so that this can be secreted in the bile. So when it's secreted in the bile, we know the bile helps in the fat absorption. The remaining bile will be going down to your intestines, and about 80% it's basically deconjugated by the colonic bacteria, and it's converted into urobilinogen and ultimately into stercobilin. The stercobilin is basically the pigment which gives the feces the dark brown color. About 20% of it, the urobilinogen, is basically absorbed by the intestines, and it's taken up either by the liver for further production of bilirubin, and the remaining one of it, it's basically converted into urobilin, which is excreted in the urine. So the causes of unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia. The unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia can either be due to excessive production of RBCs, excessive breakdown of RBCs, or defective conjugation of the liver, defective conjugation by the liver, or increased enterohepatic circulation. So we'll be discussing each of them in detail. So the physiological jaundice, the jaundice which usually appears in the newborn after 24 hours, and it's basically due to several factors. It's basically due to decreased conjugation capacity of the liver. It's due to increased RBC load in the neonate. All of these factors contribute to physiological jaundice. Polycythemia, in which there is increased production of the RBCs and increased RBC cell mass. Cephalohematoma, again, this is basically due to birth injury, and this again is increasing the level of RBC levels in the blood. Bruises, the same mechanism over here. Delayed cord clamping, again, delayed cord clamping will be ensuring that large amount of blood is basically being delivered to the fetus, again increasing the RBC load in the fetus. Feto-maternal or feto-fetal transfusion. The other cause is basically when we have excessive breakdown of RBCs, which again leads to overproduction of bilirubin. So there are conditions like they are intrinsic and extrinsic causes of hemolytic anemia. Meaning intrinsic, if there is some sort of genetic defect in the RBCs which predisposes the RBCs to premature hemolysis, like hereditary spherocytosis or G6PD deficiency, and the extrinsic causes includes drugs, RH, or ABO incompatibility. Now, if the liver has defective conjugation, this will again lead to buildup of unconjugated bilirubin levels. So we have defective conjugation present in Crigler-Najjar 1 and 2, in which the enzyme that is responsible for conjugation is basically deficient. Gilbert syndrome, in which there is the mild deficiency of the enzyme. Breast milk jaundice, again, there are certain deconjugators present in the breast milk of some mothers, which leads to deconjugation of the bilirubin and leading to buildup of unconjugated bilirubin levels. Increased enterohepatic circulation is present in conditions like ileus, intestinal obstruction, pyloric stenosis, and metabolic disorders like galactosemia, hypothyroidism. In both of these conditions, the jaundice usually persists for more than 2 weeks, and jaundice that persists for more than 2 weeks is known as persistent jaundice. So, physiological versus pathological jaundice. Physiological jaundice, as talked about earlier, the jaundice usually appears after 24 hours. In cases of pathological, the jaundice appears usually on the first day. The total bilirubin rises by less than 5 mg per deciliter per day. In cases of pathological jaundice, the total bilirubin rises more than 0.5 mg per deciliter per hour. The peak bilirubin rises to no more than 12.9 mg per deciliter in term and 15 mg per deciliter in preterm infants. In cases of preterm, the conjugation capacity of the liver is relatively less as compared to the term infants, so the peak bilirubin levels would be a little bit higher as compared to that in the term infants. The peak bilirubin levels in cases of pathological jaundice is more than 13 mg per deciliter in term and 15 mg per deciliter in the preterm infants. The clinical jaundice resolves in 1 week in term and 2 weeks in preterm infants. The clinical jaundice persists for more than 1 week in term and 2 weeks in preterm infants. In cases of pathological jaundice, other signs that indicate hemolysis like anemia, hepatosplenomegaly, they might be present as well. Hemolytic disease of the newborn. So, as talked about earlier, the acquired causes includes RH or ABO incompatibility, drugs which can either cause extra intravascular hemolysis, infections. Non-acquired causes includes hemolytic anemias like hereditary spherocytosis, in which there is an intrinsic RBC defect, and G6PD deficiency, in which the cells are particularly prone to stresses like hypoxia, acidosis, infections. RH incompatibility. So there is an incompatibility of the RH factor over here. This usually occurs when the mother is RH negative and the fetus is RH positive. So we'll be discussing the mechanism of the RH incompatibility in the slides later on. So these are the fetal RBCs, and the black markings over here denotes the RH antigen. Now, as a result of some sort of trauma, like during delivery or during a miscarriage, these fetal RBCs, they gained entry into the maternal circulation and they sensitized the immune system of the mother, and it resulted in the production of the IgM antibodies. Remember, these IgM antibodies are pentavalent antibodies. Since these IgM antibodies, due to the molecular size, they won't be able to cross the placenta. So they won't be able to destroy the fetal RBCs. But in case of subsequent exposure, like the mother got pregnant once more, these fetal RBCs, they gained entry into the maternal circulation, and over here the mother's immune system produced IgG antibodies, and these IgG antibodies are monovalent antibodies. So they will be gaining entry into maternal circulation. They will get attached to the the RH antigens in the fetus, and they will be causing agglutination and ultimately later on hemolysis in the spleen. So it will be resulting in hemolysis and anemia developing as a result of the immune system, as a result of subsequent exposure. So of RH incompatibility, so we can say that severity and incidence increases with increasing parity. So the chances of the mother or the child developing this disease will be increasing with subsequent pregnancies. Severity of hemolytic disease depends on the time at which the antibodies crosses the placenta. Like, for instance, if the antibodies crossed at term, then the infant will be presenting with mild to moderate anemia with jaundice. But if the antibodies had crossed a bit earlier, like during the second trimester, then there will be severe anemia, and that severe anemia will be putting the pressure on the heart, resulting in cardiac failure, hydrops fetalis, generalized edema, hepatosplenomegaly. One more thing that needs to be remembered is basically that major blood group incompatibility, that is ABO incompatibility between the mother and the fetus, usually protects the child from hemolysis, as incompatible fetal cells are destroyed before they are able to sensitize the RH system. So the ABO incompatible cells, if they are ABO incompatible cells, they will be destroyed before they sensitize the RH system. ABO incompatibility. Incidence is basically more, but hemolysis is less likely. The reason why the hemolysis is less likely, it will be discussed later on. It usually occurs when the mother's blood group is O, meaning the mother's blood group does not have any antigen on it, and the fetus is A or B, which is basically foreign to the mother. Severe hemolysis is basically less likely, as anti-A or anti-B antibodies are usually IgM, and as discussed previously, the IgM antibodies are pentavalent and it won't be able to cross the circulation. The fetal A and B antigens are weak, and thus we have an immune response that is also weak. ABO incompatibility can be seen in the first pregnancy as well, in contrast to Rh incompatibility, which is usually seen in subsequent pregnancies. Crigler-Najjar syndrome type 1 and type 2. So type 1 is basically the one that is a severe defect, and the type 2 is basically in which we have a moderate defect. So the mode of inheritance in type 1 is autosomal recessive, and in case of type 2 it's autosomal dominant. So enzyme defect over here is complete, that is, it is a severe defect, and over here the enzyme activity is partially present. Type 1 is more severe, and you have a more rise in the peak bilirubin levels that occurs early on in the disease process as well, and less severe with less rise of peak bilirubin, and usually it's around 12 milligrams per deciliter. This one again, as we have high levels of unconjugated bilirubin levels in blood, which leads to free bilirubin levels in the blood, and this will be associated with Kernicterus. That's a neurological manifestation of high levels of bilirubin, and over here in case of type 2 there's low risk of Kernicterus. Gilbert syndrome, again, there is mild deficiency of the glucuronide transferase, and this usually manifests itself in conditions when there are stresses, like either the person is fasting, or there is some sort of heavy exercise, or excessive alcohol consumption that puts a load on your liver. So it's a benign familial disorder, and the type of inheritance is autosomal recessive over here, and it's characterized by intermittent jaundice, usually precipitated by stresses like exercise, fasting, menstruation. Again, there is no hepatic or hemolytic condition present. Again, this is due to a mutation in UGT1A1 gene with low levels of bilirubin UTP glucuronide transferase activity. Usually no treatment is required. You just need to avoid the stresses, and then patient does not require any treatment. Breast milk jaundice. This is basically due to late onset unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia, and it's due to inhibitor of conjugation present in breast milk. So you might be having a history that the mother's previous children also had that disease process. So this peaks at about 10 to 15 days of age and then falls by 4 to 12 weeks. If breastfeeding is stopped, then the bilirubin falls rapidly in 48 hours, and then if you restart breastfeeding, the bilirubin levels won't rebound to the same level as previously seen. Breastfeeding jaundice, this is different from breast milk jaundice, which was due to the different substances in the breast milk that was inhibiting the conjugation. In breastfeeding jaundice, it's basically due to inadequate feeding. So it occurs in 1 week of life. That inadequate feeding actually causes increased enterohepatic circulation of bilirubin and ultimately large amounts of bilirubin levels in the blood. So newborn receives suboptimal milk, which leads to increased enterohepatic circulation of bilirubin. Kernicterus. So this is a neurological manifestation of high levels of unconjugated bilirubin in the blood. As we all know, when there is high levels of free bilirubin, it can easily cross the blood-brain barrier because the unconjugated bilirubin is lipid soluble, and it can easily cross the blood-brain barrier, and then it goes and gets deposited in different regions of the brain, especially the basal ganglia and the 3rd and 8th cranial nerves. And then as a result of that deposition, that was also known as nuclear jaundice, as a result of that deposition, you will be having different symptoms of Kernicterus. So when enteric serum bilirubin rises, it crosses the blood-brain barrier as it's lipid soluble, and it stains the basal ganglia. 3rd, that's the oculomotor nerve, and the 8th, that's the vestibulocochlear nerve. And this type of staining, it's actually known as nuclear jaundice. So serum bilirubin above 20 mg per deciliter in normal healthy infants, and above 10 mg in preterm infants or infants with a prior insult, like maybe the child had asphyxia, acidosis, or hypothermia. So in these infants, the bilirubin levels of even 10 milligrams per deciliter is enough to cause Kernicterus. So symptoms. So you will be having a deeply jaundiced child, and that child suddenly develops poor sucking, absent morose. Absent morose again indicates some sort of neurodevelopmental process, neurodevelopmental delay that's happening. High pitched cry, increased muscle tone, and opisthotonus. That's the backward arching of the head, neck, and the vertebra, the spine. Again, it might progress, and apnea, respiratory irregularity, uprolling of the eyeballs, and convulsions might develop. Majority majority of the patients who develop Kernick-Terrace, they do not survive, but those who do, they develop complete neurological syndromes by the second and third decade of life, in which they have bilateral chorioathetosis, extrapyramidal signs, high tone deafness, seizures, and MR. So once Kernick-Terrace develops, it's irreversible. You cannot do anything to delay the process or actually to reverse the process. It can be prevented by vigilant monitoring of the bilirubin levels in a child who already has jaundice, and to taking extra care, and to start with phototherapy or the exchange transfusion in a child if required. So, however, it can be prevented by monitoring bilirubin levels, phototherapy, and exchange transfusion if required. So, this concludes our discussion of unconjugated hyperbilirubinemia.